Do you have the exhibit in front of you, Dr. Hammers?
I do.
What are we looking at here in Exhibit 573?
So this is a photograph of Miss Mullis's back, particularly looking at it from the right side. In the upper right, you can see the back of her, where her arm meets her shoulder, so like the back of the armpit area. And there are 6 puncture defects that are on her right backside, extending across her back. And amongst some of those, there's 1 abrasion or scraping type of injury to the skin.
Are you familiar with a term, wound pattern analysis?
Yes.
What is that?
That's essentially when you look at each individual wound and look at any specific features like the size, the shape, the orientation, and the features around the wound. And then when you take all of the wounds that you have and look at them for any kind of patterns that they might have, or similarities or differences that they might have, to try to group some or all of the injuries together to understand how someone may have sustained those injuries.
Did you do that type of analysis on the injuries that on Miss Mullis's body?
Yes, I did.
And first of all, in general terms, how would you describe the injuries that we're seeing in Exhibit 573?
So all of the injuries but that small scrape to the skin are all puncture types of defects or penetrating defects, meaning that the injury is going deeper into the body than it is large on the surface of the skin.
Can you give me an example of something that would be a penetrating defect?
Yes, so common things that we see that are penetrating defects would be things like gunshot wounds and stab wounds.
All right. Those aren't the only types of penetrating defects, I take it?
No, there's multiple other types of objects that can cause penetrating defects, but those are the most common that we see.
All right. In this case, you've reviewed Dr. Cruz's reports, and you reviewed prior testimony from Dr. Cruz as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
In Dr. Cruz's analysis or Dr. Cruz's testimony about this case, did she assign letters to various of these wounds?
Yes, she did.
All right, and have you adopted those letters in your analysis?
Yes.
Which letters have been assigned to which of these wounds in this case?
So she labeled them letters A through F. 6 wounds lettered A through F, and she started on the right side, which is the right side of this picture, with A, and then moving across the body, B and C, and then D she labeled as the lowest wound, and then E and F traveling upward.
To make sure that I understand, wound A is on the right side of the picture under her armpit, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And do you see a wound that is up from the ruler, but sort of at the end of the ruler?
Yes.
What is that B?
That is B, correct.
All right. Then in the middle of the photograph, I get, well, more on the left side of the photograph, but in line with B, do you see 3 injuries and a line?
Yes.
Okay, so the injury that has the line, that's what you described as an abrasion, is that right?
That's correct.
The injury that is below that abrasion, which number or which letter is that?
That was wound D.
All right, and then above wound D, there are 2 injuries right there?
Yes.
And which is on the right?
C is on the right, and E is on the left.
All right, and then there's another injury that's more to the top left-hand corner of the photo?
Yes.
What's that?
That Dr. Cruz labeled as F.
Right. Are any of these wounds, A through F, different from other wounds in the pattern?
They all are penetrating injuries, but some of them are just looking at them without adjusting them or moving the skin or examining them further. Some of them are larger than other ones, and some of them are a little bit smaller.
Which are larger?
Wounds A and B are the largest, with wound A being the larger of the 2. And then wounds E and F are slightly larger than C and D.
And when you're talking about being larger or smaller in this context, are you talking about depth or circumference, or what are you referencing?
So just looking at the skin here, the differences that you can see are going to be in the somewhat the size and shape of the actual like defect in the skin or the hole in the skin, and then the skin around that defect that has some changes where you can see discoloration, which is abrasion and contusion or scraping and bleeding.
Looking at well, in general with these wounds, did any of them have exit wounds on Miss Mullis's body that were associated with them?
So wound A had an injury on the front right breast that was in line with all of the injury path that was ultimately described on the internal examination, and was the end point of that injury path.
You mentioned earlier in your testimony that it's important to that part of your analysis is to look at medical records or records of treatment from different periods of time to gain an understanding of treatment over time. In that context, can the appearance of injuries on someone's body change over time?
Yes, they can.
And can you explain why that's the case?
Sure. So anytime the skin is broken or damaged, it makes the skin go from dry to having moisture, and anytime there's moisture on the skin or on an injury, that area is subject to drying, and that can change the color, the extent, and some of the features of the wounds. I think we've identified which of these wounds have which letter. And I think it's your testimony that these wounds had different depths, is that right? I did not testify to that, but they did have different depths, yes.
And sorry, I want to go through and talk about the depths of these wounds, so let's start there. So for wound A, the wound on the right, how deep was that wound?
Off the top of my head, my recollection was that was about 6.5 inches deep.
And what about wound B, the next wound over?
That one was not quite as deep. I believe it was about 6 inches. And I don't know if you want me to look at the autopsy report or not, just to make sure that I'm giving you the accurate measurements. Let
me ask you this. Did you review records from Dr. Cruz where she noted measurements of the depths of these wounds at the autopsy?
Yes, in her notes and at the autopsy, she had these documented, the size, the features surrounding the wounds, the depths of the wounds, and the measurements between the wounds and the orientation of them.
And before we talk a little more about depth, let me ask you this. Just looking at the external appearance of these wounds, the way that you see them in Exhibit 573, for you as a forensic pathologist, can you draw any conclusions about a situation where you have a pattern of wounds where some of them have different appearance than the others?
Yes, I mean, I can come up with possibilities.
And what are some possibilities for why that might be the case?
So it could be that there is movement of an object while it's in the body, which can extend the size and change some of the features around of the surrounding skin. And it can be that there are more shallow or deeper depths of penetration with an object, which can change the appearance slightly. So if you presume that it's the same object causing all of the injuries, you could explain differences in them based off of movement and the depth of the penetration.
All right, and you mentioned that you think that the concept of movement is relevant to considering the pattern of injuries. Is that right?
Yes.
How does it impact your analysis of injuries to think about the body as something that moves?
So it can change. It can change two things. So if an object, thinking about an object penetrating the body and being in the body while there's movement, that can change the size and features of the wound itself. But then looking at the body as a whole and knowing that particularly this part of the body, the torso or the chest, back, and abdomen, is highly movable, it allows me to know that there can be a movement of the location of the body either closer together or further apart based off of the position that the person's body is in at the time that they're sustaining the injuries.
You mentioned earlier that having access to the measurements of the depths would aid in your testimony. And let me ask you first, in addition to looking at measurements from Dr. Cruz of the depths of these wounds, did you have access to measurements that Dr. Cruz took of the distance between the wounds?
Yes, she had those in her notes, and she had, I think, all but one of them from her notes were in her autopsy report as well.
And was that information you took into account in your analysis?
Yes, it was.
Why?
Because understanding that information aids in understanding and coming to conclusions about how this set of injuries might have been sustained.
Would looking at a demonstrative of photographs of Ms. Mullis's wounds with some of those distances noted on it, would that aid in your testimony?
Yes.
All right, at this point, Your Honor, I'm going to show the witness a demonstrative, which we've provided to the state to aid in the witness's testimony.
And as I understand it, that's been reviewed and there's no objection, is that correct?
Yeah, correct, Judge. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Are you able to see the demonstrative in front of you, Dr. Hammers?
Yes, I am.
And what is the demonstrative that you're looking at show?
So this shows the injuries that we just saw in the previous picture, similar orientation and view, but has added colored lines and measurements between the wounds, kind of in a order from A to B, B to C, C to D, etc. And it shows the measurements that Dr. Cruz made and documented of the distances between those wounds that are the actual numbers in inches.
Just one moment, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to show the witness a slightly different demonstrative, which I believe the state has also seen. Dr. Hammers, what does the demonstrative in front of you show?
So this is an image that shows wounds B through F, as well as that small abrasion. You're not able to see wound A on this picture because it's a little more toward the right side. But this is a more straight-on picture of Ms. Mullis's back, showing 5 of the 6 injuries, showing those lines again between the injuries with the measurements that Dr. Cruz took. But this time it also, next to the large black letter that is the wound that Dr. Cruz designated and that we've kept for this discussion, it shows the size of the wound as she measured it in parenthesis, and then the depth of the wound, meaning how far or long into the body that she measured the path of the injury going.
And so does looking at this diagram help you tell us, help you review for us what the depths of these various wounds were?
Yes.
Can you, I understand we can't see wound A on here, and we'll get to that in a minute, but can you tell us what the relative depths of wounds B through F were on Ms. Mullis's back?
Sure. So wound B went 6.5 inches deep. Wound C went 3 3/4 of an inch deep. Wound D went 2 inches deep, and wound E was 6 1/2 inches deep, and wound F was 3 3/4 of an inch deep.
So B and E are the deepest wounds?
Of these 5, yes, those are the 2 deepest wounds.
All right, and which is the shallowest wound?
Wound D at 2 inches was the most shallow.
As an aside, I mean, looking at the measurements here between the wounds, for instance, did Dr. Cruz mention that the distance between wound B and wound C was 3 inches?
Yes, she did.
Does that mean that if wounds B and C were sustained at the same time, that they were 3 inches apart at the time an injury was sustained?
They may have been, but not necessarily based off of the position of Ms. Mullis's body.
And can you explain why the position would impact that?
Sure. So with the torso and specifically the back, a person is able to either hyperflex or hyperextend. So in hyperflexion, they would be kind of like pulled forward with their shoulders forward, maybe bent forward, and hyperextended, they would be back, like with their shoulders back, their back arched, maybe their neck back, or even twisted, bent to the side or rotated to the side. And so those positions are going to change the distance, the actual distance at the time of the injury between those 2 injuries. So it could be that the injuries were sustained with the body at 3 inches apart, or it could have been closer or further away.
Does the fact that someone's back, as you've described, can move and twist, does that mean that it's not possible to draw conclusions about the pattern of a wound, given that those distances might change?
No, you can still make some hypothesis or draw similarities from the wounds, both from all of the measurements that we've talked about so far.
All right, I'm going to show you an additional diagram. I'm going to show you an additional diagram that adds in wound A to these measurements. Would that aid in your testimony?
Yes.
All right. Is what you're looking at in this demonstrative the picture we've been looking at with measurements of wounds B through F, with some measurements between wound A and B added?
Yes.
And where wound A on the left side would be under Ms. Mullis's armpit in an area that's between her side and her armpit, correct?
Correct.
And that's what's depicted on the other photo?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us what the depth of wound A was?
So the depth of wound A was 6 inches.
All right. And what was the relative distance between wound A and wound B?
It was 4.5 inches.
And I want to make sure that what I said was clear. I think I may have said that wound A was on the left side. Would wound A have been to the right of wound B on this picture we're looking at on the left side of the left of the 2 photographs?
Yes, in the left of the 2 photographs, the wound A would have been toward the right, kind of between the side of the body and the arm.
As part of your, as a forensic pathologist, as part of your evaluation of injuries, are you trying to think through the position that a body might have been at the time that a certain pattern of injuries occurred?
Yes, so part of my analysis, if I have no indication of what may have caused these injuries, would be to think of them individually or as a group or groups to try to come up with an idea of what type of object or instrument could have caused this. And then if an instrument is posed to me as either known to or likely to have caused those injuries, I would then analyze the injuries with that object in mind, trying to understand if it's possible to have this injury, set of injuries caused by that object.
All right, and in this case, the materials you've been provided indicate that there was an object called a corn rake that was involved in these injuries?
Yes.
Did you, as part of your analysis, have an opportunity to examine the corn rake at issue in this case?
I saw photographs of the corn rake.
in your mind, based on everything that you reviewed, is there any question that wounds A through F were caused by Ms. Mullis's body coming in contact with that corn rake in some way?
From looking at the injuries and from all of the information that I reviewed, the injuries are consistent with that, and I did not see anything where that was debated that that was the object that caused these injuries.
Thinking about the corn rake that we're talking about, do you know what the distance between the tines of that corn rake are?
So the distance between the tines is just shy of 3 inches, so it's almost 3 inches.
How do you have that number?
From a photograph.
Given, so in your analysis, understanding that the object at issue here is this corn rake and that you have these injuries on Ms. Mullis's back, in your opinion, is there a pattern to the injuries on Ms. Mullis's back that we're looking at?
There is, yes.
And what is your opinion about what that pattern is?
My opinion is that there's 3 injuries that you can cluster together that have similar features, which is A, B, and C. There's 2 injuries that have similar features, E and F, that you can cluster together. And then there is wound D, which is kind of on its own and a little bit separate in its orientation and features.
How are you able to determine that A, B, and C are sort of one set of connected injuries?
So looking at the spacing between them, so the wounds B and C has a 3-inch length between them, and wounds A and B is 4.5 inches. That 4.5 inches is over a curved part of the body, however. So in reality, a more narrow object could make both of those injuries at the same time if it's penetrating the body, particularly at an angle. And they also have a similar orientation of the wounds themselves if you face them on like the face of a clock. So they're all going in, all 3 of them are in the same orientation that way.
And so when you say they're in the same orientation, explain to me what you mean by that.
So when we describe injuries, we can describe them using the face of a clock. So if something is straight up and down, so in orientation with the head and the feet would be straight up and down, that's vertical. You could describe that as vertical, or you could describe it as 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. If something is across the body from left to right, like straight across, you could describe that as transverse or horizontal. But putting it on the face of the clock, you could use 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And then anything else would be oblique. And you could place it on the face of a clock using, 2 o'clock and 7 o'clock, for example. And so looking at these 3 injuries, they had a similar oblique orientation on the face of a clock that Dr. Cruz documented in her autopsy report.
Is your opinion about the orientation of Ms. Mullis's wounds different from Dr. Cruz's opinion about the orientation of any of these 6 wounds, A through F?
No, it is not.
You also said that E and F are wounds that you would group together, is that right?
Yes.
And why is that your opinion?
So they're 3 3/4 of an inch apart, which is, again, pretty similar to what A and B and C are, but they have a different orientation. When you put it on the face of the clock, they're both the same, E and F, but they're different from A, B, and C, and they're different than D.
What is their orientation?
These were at, my recollection is 5 o'clock and 11 o'clock is how they were described.
All right, and you said that D is in a different group?
Yeah, so D had an orientation that was just one basically number off of A, B, and C. So it was just slightly differently oriented than A, B, and C.
I want to take you back to Exhibit 573. Sorry, tell me what you're saying. All right, we're showing you Exhibit 573 again. Now, Exhibit 573 is that the same image that appears on the left two of the photos that you were looking at a moment ago that is marked?
The ones that we just looked at that was a straight on of the back. This is from an angle.
All right, and let me go back and show you the last photo, the second to last photo that we looked at.
Okay.
While we're doing that, let me actually ask you, well, let me show you this exhibit first. I want to ask you a different question, and we'll come back to this. You mentioned that wounds A and B looked different than the other wounds on the back. Can you explain why those, or how those wounds had a different appearance?
Sure. So wound A, even more so than wound B, had a much larger overall size. And around the wound, so the skin around wounds A and B had additional abrasion and contusion of the surrounding skin. So in addition to the wound being larger, there was also injury to the skin around the wounds that was different than the rest of the injuries.
All right, I'm going to show you Exhibit 561. What does Exhibit 561 depict?
So this is wound A on the right side of the body. This shows the medical therapy at the top, which is the chest tube that was inserted at the hospital. And then,
just to interrupt you, the chest tube is not wound A.
Correct, that's the medical therapy. And then below that is wound A. So there's a hole in the skin, and then there's a sort of pink to red to kind of dark, maybe purplish color around the skin around that wound A, and that is the abrasion and contusion of the skin around that wound.
So is the appearance of wound A different from the appearances of wounds C through F?
Yes.
And
Here's what I found.
what specifically about the appearance of wound A in this picture was different than wounds C through F?
So rather than just having a little bit of injury around the actual wound in the skin, there was this enlarged area of abrasion and contusion around the wound. So that discoloration of the skin is different than the other wounds.
All right, I want to go back and show you one more time Exhibit 573. All right, do you see wound B in this picture?
Yes.
How was the appearance of wound B different from wounds C through F?
So wound B also has that injury of the skin that's abrasion and contusion, and this time it's above the injury, so more toward the top of the picture, and it has, from here, has kind of like a pinkish to purple coloration, and the wound itself is actually at the bottom of that, and then that discoloration and injury of the skin is above.
Did you take into account the characteristics of the corn rake in this case in thinking through how to group these injuries?
Yes.
And how did you do that?
So thinking about the spacing of the tines of the corn rake being just about 3 inches, and trying to look at on the body knowing that the body can move some or even extensively, and then looking at the features of the tines. The ends of the tines are kind of flattened, and they then sort of expand to a more rounded part of the tine. And so when I looked at the injuries and looked at Dr. Cruz's measurements, she measured all of them ultimately when she kind of reapproximated the edges of the injuries at 1/16 of an inch, which is consistent with the tines on the rake penetrating the skin, and allowed for that orientation of those tines, since they're flattened, into the body.
All right, and I want to understand what you just said. When you talk about reapproximating the edges of the injury, explain to me what that process entails.
Sure. So when a body is injured, there are invisible lines that are elastic forces in the skin that everybody has. And so when the skin is damaged, those elastic lines can pull on the wound, and they can cause them to what we call gape, or to kind of be kind of open. So if we take our hands and we remove some of that tension, we can actually make a much more accurate measurement of the wound. And so that's what Dr. Cruz did. So she reapproximated, or took the edges of the wound and kind of pushed them back together to see where there was a piece of tissue that was actually lost from the puncture of that tine. And so when she did that, each of the wounds were 1/16 of an inch. That was the size of all 6 of them. Being able to push that back together, you got that approximation. So those were all the same, which made it consistent with one object also. But when you push that back together, that also allows, so you basically have this 1/16 of an inch, and then it was angled, right, or obliquely oriented like we described before. And so looking at the size and the fact that you can tell an orientation as opposed to it being just like a circle, basically, you can then look at the ends of those tines, which are flattened, and see that that flattened end of the tine is consistent with what we're seeing on the body when you reapproximate the wounds.
All right, Dr. Hammers, I'm not a doctor, but is it your testimony that the holes in Ms. Mullis's back are not round?
When you reapproximate them, they're not round.
All right, and is the end of the corn rake round?
No, they're flattened to, I don't want to say it's rectangular, but they're flattened to that type of shape.
And does the fact that the wounds have an oblique shape, as you've described, and the corn rake has an oblique shape, does that allow you to determine, as you've described, the orientation of the wound and the orientation of the rake at the time that the rake made any of these wounds?
Yes. So because all 4 of the tines are flattened, if you have 3 wounds that have a similar orientation, and that would indicate that 3 tines are going in likely at the same time in that similar orientation.
All right, and with all of those factors in mind, and those factors in your analysis that you've testified about, do you have an opinion on which, if any, of wounds A through F were caused at the same time?
So looking at just the body, from the pattern of the injuries and the individual features of each injury, it appears that wounds A, B, and C occurred at a similar time, wounds E and F at a similar time, and wound D at a somewhat different time.
And are you basing that opinion just on their orientation?
So it's the orientation and the features of the wounds.
In thinking through that, well, let me ask you this first. Do you have an opinion on the order of wounds A through F being caused?
Well, my opinion is that wounds A and B, given the features around them, is that those likely occurred in the first set of injuries and then remained in the body while other injuries occurred, given the fact that they're distorted and they have injury of the skin beyond what the other injuries have.
I want to go back to Exhibit 561 briefly. Looking at Exhibit 561 and wound A that's depicted in 561, what about this wound leads you to conclude that a tine went into wound A and remained there?
So if you take a long, blunt object and it penetrates into the skin and then there's movement, it's going to cause bruising and abrasion of that surrounding skin. So if it goes straight in and straight out, we would, without any movement, we would not expect there to be this larger area of injury of the skin. So the fact that the wound is larger and has this area on the surface of the skin is very consistent with movement, and then ultimately putting that into the context of what was seen on the internal examination, that's also very supportive of that as well. So I'm talking right now about the skin itself, but my conclusions are made using the internal exam as well.
And we'll get to the internal exam in a moment, but just looking, thinking about your evaluation of wound A, how do you know, for instance, for wound A, that the features of the wound that you're describing, which you attribute to a tine being in wound A and being moved around, how do you know that those features aren't caused by a tine of the corn rake coming all the way out of wound A and then going back into wound A?
So first of all, the statistical probability of a tine coming out and going back into the same spot is very low. Second of all, I would expect that the features of the wound would not have that pattern when you reapproximate them, that it would be 1/16 of an inch, just like the rest of the injuries, that it would be more extended beyond that or more irregular. So the fact that we can reapproximate to that 1/16 of an inch is highly indicative of one penetrating injury.
And what is that issue in terms of reapproximating the size of the wound? What is your determination about the size of wound B in that respect?
Wound B also, when you approximate it, is 1/16 of an inch, just like the rest of them. So all of the wounds are consistent with the tine penetrating the body one time, and then A and B are consistent with movement of the tines while they're in the body from that one penetrating defect.
All right.
Ms. Thompson, would this be a good place for a morning break?
I think it would, Your Honor.
Okay,